A hangar floor at an English aircraft works. Late in 1965, men in overalls moved between the jigs and fixtures that, only months earlier, were shaping some of the most advanced aerospace engineering Britain had ever produced. Now they're doing the opposite. Cutting torches hiss against steel tooling built to a precision of thousandths of an inch, reducing it to scrap that will be sold, quite literally, by weight. In another room, filing cabinets full of engineering drawings, years of calculations, stress tests, wind tunnel data are being emptied and burned. The order didn't come from an accident or a fire or an enemy. It came from London, in writing, from the government of the United Kingdom, directed at an aircraft that, 7 months earlier, had flown faster and higher and more precisely than almost anything else in the sky. So here's the version of this story that gets repeated most often. The TSR-2 was a brilliant but absurdly expensive prestige project, and a new government, faced with a budget crisis, made the hard but sensible call to kill it. Case closed, a sad but rational story about fiscal discipline. Except that explanation doesn't account for the part that should actually bother you. Cancelling a program is one decision. Ordering the physical destruction of the prototypes that already existed, the tools required to ever build another one, and the blueprints needed to even remember how, that's a different decision entirely. And it's the one this video is actually about. Here's the question worth sitting with. Why would a government not simply cancel a working aircraft, but go to the additional trouble of making absolutely certain it could never, under any future government, under any future circumstance, be built again? That's not budget discipline. That's something closer to making sure a decision can never be reversed. To understand why the destruction mattered as much as the cancellation, you have to go back to why this aircraft existed in the first place and what Britain was trying to prove when it started building it. And it's worth being precise about what made this particular act of destruction so unusual, even among the long, unglamorous history of cancelled defense programs. Governments cancel weapons projects constantly, in every country, for every kind of reason. Cost, changing threats, changing priorities, plain bad luck. That's normal. What's not normal, what almost never happens even when a program is cancelled outright, is a government going out of its way to guarantee that the cancelled thing could never physically exist again, even under a future administration that might reach a completely different judgment. That extra, deliberate step is the anomaly at the heart of this story, and it's the one most retellings of the TSR-2 skip straight past on their way to talking about budgets. Rewind to the mid-1950s. Britain, a decade removed from the Second World War, is trying to hold on to something it's rapidly losing, the sense that it remains a first-rank military and industrial power in a world now organized around two much larger superpowers. The RAF's existing bomber, the Canberra, had been a genuinely excellent aircraft in its day, fast and high-flying for the era it was designed in. But Soviet radar and interceptor technology had moved on, and moved on fast. High-altitude bombing runs, the kind that had defined strategic air power since the war, were becoming a death sentence against modern integrated air defenses. The answer that emerged across several air forces at once was a brutal, elegant idea. Go under the radar, literally. Fly so low and so fast that ground-based radar simply couldn't track you in time to bring a missile or fighter to bear before you were gone. It sounds simple stated that way. Executing it was one of the hardest engineering problems in aviation. This wasn't an abstract technical exercise. Britain's nuclear deterrent strategy in this period leaned heavily on the ability to actually deliver a weapon against a heavily defended target deep inside Soviet airspace. And by the late 1950s, the existing generation of high-flying V-bombers was becoming increasingly vulnerable to exactly the kind of integrated radar and surface-to-air missile networks the Soviet Union was rapidly building. A credible deterrent depends on the other side believing you can actually strike, not just that you intend to. If the delivery aircraft could be tracked and shot down before reaching its target, the entire logic of deterrence started to look shaky. So the requirement that produced the TSR-2 wasn't a matter of national pride alone. It was treated, inside the Ministry of Defense, as a genuine strategic necessity, one Britain judged it could not simply outsource or delay. What Britain set out to build was an aircraft that could scream across hostile territory at more than twice the speed of sound, at an altitude low enough to hug the terrain itself, using onboard radar sophisticated enough to automatically follow the contours of hills and valleys without the pilot needing to react by eye. Understand what that actually demanded from the airframe. At that speed, at that altitude, turbulence off the ground alone could tear a poorly designed aircraft apart. The structure had to be strong enough to survive being thrown around by air currents at treetop height while flying faster than a rifle bullet, and light enough to still make the speed and range figures the mission required. The engines, a pair of Bristol Siddeley Olympus turbojets, developed specifically for this aircraft and fitted with reheat for the sustained supersonic dash, had to deliver enormous thrust reliably enough to trust with a nuclear strike mission deep into hostile airspace. This is the aircraft that would become the BAC TSR-2. TSR standing, plainly enough, for tactical strike and reconnaissance. Consider what the terrain-following radar alone represented as an engineering problem. This wasn't a system that simply told a pilot how high they were flying. It had to continuously scan the ground ahead, interpret the shape of hills and valleys rushing past at hundreds of miles an hour, and feed that information into the aircraft's flight controls quickly enough to adjust course before a ridgeline became a collision. Get the timing wrong by even a fraction of a second at that speed and altitude, and there's no margin for correction. No other country had yet made a system like that work reliably in an operational aircraft. Britain was trying to be first, and around that single radar problem sat dozens of equally demanding challenges. A fuel system that had to keep the engines fed evenly through violent low-altitude turbulence. An airframe skin that had to tolerate the intense aerodynamic heating generated by sustained supersonic flight at low level. A cockpit that had to keep 2 crew members functioning, reading instruments and making split-second decisions while being thrown around at speeds their bodies were never evolved to withstand. Picture the assembly hall at Weybridge in the early 1960s, because this image is going to matter again later, under very different circumstances. Rows of skilled draftsmen bent over drawing boards the size of dining tables, translating theoretical airflow calculations into physical dimensions accurate to fractions of a millimeter. Machinists on the shop floor shaping titanium and high-strength steel components that, at the time, pushed against the limits of what British industry had ever attempted to manufacture. The very existence of BAC, the British Aircraft Corporation, was itself a product of this project's ambition. The government had effectively forced a consolidation of several rival aircraft manufacturers, companies with their own histories, their own proud engineering traditions, their own instinct to compete rather than cooperate, and pushed them into a single organization capable of building something this complex. That in itself was a kind of quiet institutional achievement, layered underneath the aerodynamic one. And then, in September 1964, the aircraft actually flew. Test pilot Roland Beaumont took the first prototype into the air from Boscombe Down, and what happened next surprised almost everyone who'd spent the previous years worrying about whether this enormously ambitious design would actually work. It didn't just fly, it flew beautifully. Beaumont would later describe handling qualities that felt remarkably stable and controllable for an aircraft operating at the very edge of known aerodynamic territory. Precisely the kind of behavior you'd want in a jet meant to skim terrain at supersonic speed with a nuclear weapon in its bay. Over the flights that followed, the TSR-2 continued to meet, and in some figures exceed, the extraordinarily demanding performance targets it had been designed against. Everything the engineers at that drawing board in Weybridge had calculated on paper years earlier was now being confirmed in the air under test conditions by an aircraft that, on the numbers, had no direct equal anywhere in the world at that moment. The flight test program that followed those first cautious sorties kept adding to that record. Subsequent flights pushed the aircraft toward the supersonic performance envelope it had been designed around, and the results kept landing on the right side of the predictions rather than the wrong one. The outcome every aerospace program hopes for, and relatively few, given how much can go wrong translating theory into hardware, actually achieve on schedule. Engineers who had spent years defending contested design choices on paper, sometimes against skepticism from within their own industry, were now watching those choices validated by an aircraft that flew as advertised. For a program that had absorbed years of public scrutiny over its rising costs, that string of successful test flights should have been the moment the argument was settled in its favor. Direct address here because it matters. Understand that this wasn't a program still trying to prove itself. By late 1964, the TSR-2 had already proven itself. The engineering bet had paid off. There's an obvious villain sitting in this story, and it's worth naming before setting it aside, because it's the explanation most people reach for first. The incoming Labour government, elected in October 1964, hostile on principle to an expensive prestige project inherited from the previous Conservative administration, looking for a high-profile target to demonstrate fiscal seriousness. There's some truth buried in that framing. The new Chancellor did inherit a genuinely difficult economic picture, and the TSR-2's costs had indeed climbed well beyond their original estimates, as costs on genuinely novel aerospace programs very often do. But treating ideological hostility or straightforward budget arithmetic as the real explanation misses the actual mechanism of what happened next, and it misses it in a way that matters. Because the decision that sealed the TSR-2's fate wasn't really about the plane's cost at all. It was about an alternative that had already been quietly arranged, a deal to purchase the American General Dynamics F-111, a swing-wing strike aircraft still itself deep in its own troubled development, offered to Britain on terms that looked, on paper and in the political moment, more attractive than continuing to fund a homegrown program running over budget. In April 1965, the Chancellor stood up and cancelled the TSR-2, folding the decision into the government's budget statement, and announced the F-111 purchase as its replacement. On its face, that's just program substitution, a rational-sounding trade. But look at the timing and the framing a little more closely. The cancellation wasn't presented to the public primarily as a defence strategy decision, weighed against alternative British aircraft or a modified, scaled-back version of the same program. It was presented, deliberately, inside a budget statement, an economic announcement, positioned alongside other spending cuts, designed to read as fiscal housekeeping rather than as the end of the country's most advanced military aircraft program. That framing mattered. It let the decision travel through Parliament and through public opinion with far less scrutiny of the strategic trade-off actually being made than a defence debate alone would have generated. A plane that flew, by every account, better than expected, was being retired using the language usually reserved for trimming an overspent departmental budget. What happened over the months that followed is where this stops looking rational and starts looking like something else. The government didn't simply mothball the existing prototypes in a hangar somewhere in case future budgets improved. It ordered them destroyed. It ordered the specialized production tooling, the jigs and fixtures that had taken years to design and build, the physical infrastructure without which no future TSR-2 could ever be manufactured again, cut apart and scrapped. And it ordered the engineering drawings, the accumulated technical knowledge of how this aircraft actually worked, destroyed as well. Almost the entire physical and intellectual record of the program was eliminated, methodically, over a matter of months, by direct government instruction. One partially complete airframe survived, more by administrative accident than by any deliberate act of preservation, and today sits in a museum as close to the only physical proof that any of this ever existed. Think about the scale of what that destruction order actually required to carry out. This wasn't a single filing cabinet emptied in an afternoon. It meant coordinating the dismantling of production jigs spread across multiple facilities, each one a precisely engineered fixture that had itself taken skilled toolmakers months to build and calibrate before a single aircraft component could be manufactured against it. It meant tracking down and destroying drawings that, in a program of this complexity, ran to many thousands of individual sheets, covering everything from the overall airframe geometry down to the tolerance on a single rivet. Carrying that out wasn't an act of negligence or bureaucratic drift. It required sustained, deliberate effort, sustained over months, by people who had to be explicitly instructed and who then had to go and do it, cut apart tooling that had cost a fortune to build, and consign engineering drawings representing years of collective expertise to a furnace on direct government order. I'll be honest about something. The more time I spent with this story, the less it read to me as a simple tale of an expensive plane getting cancelled, and the more it read as a story about a government deliberately trying to make its own decision impossible to undo. You don't burn blueprints to save money. Storing paper costs nothing. You burn blueprints and scrap purpose-built tooling that has no resale value to anyone else, when what you're actually protecting isn't the treasury, it's the decision itself, insulated against every future minister, every future change of political wind, every future engineer who might otherwise look at that surviving prototype's flight data and start asking why on earth this program was ever stopped. And the years that followed gave those future critics plenty of reason to ask exactly that question. The F-111 purchase that had justified killing the TSR-2 ran into its own severe cost escalation and delays, the same pattern of ballooning budgets that had supposedly made the British aircraft unaffordable. Within a few years, Britain cancelled the F-111 order too, left, in the end, with neither the aircraft it had built nor the aircraft it had bought to replace it. A gap in genuinely advanced strike aircraft capability that took the RAF years and considerable additional expense to fill by other means. Go back to that assembly hall at Weybridge one more time, the one full of draftsmen and machinists at the peak of the program. Picture it a year or two after the cancellation. Empty. The skilled workforce that had spent years developing expertise in cutting-edge aerospace manufacturing didn't simply wait around for the next great British program to materialize. Engineers and technicians dispersed into other industries, into aviation programs in other countries that were only too glad to absorb talent Britain had just finished training and then discarded. That's not a minor footnote. That's the actual measurable cost of the destruction order, the one that doesn't show up in any single budget line, but shows up over the following decade in just how much harder it became for British aerospace to compete at the frontier it had briefly, genuinely occupied in 1964. Some of those displaced engineers ended up on other major aerospace projects entirely, taking with them expertise in structures, propulsion, and systems integration that had been built specifically around solving the TSR-2's uniquely difficult problems. Institutional knowledge like that doesn't transfer back easily once it's gone. You can rebuild a factory. Rebuilding the accumulated, specific, hard-won experience of a team that has already solved a particular category of aerospace problem takes years, sometimes an entire career's worth of time, and there's no guarantee the next generation gets the chance to solve it again from a standing start. Meanwhile, the F-111 saga kept unfolding in the background, almost as if to underline the point. The aircraft Britain had chosen instead of its own design kept slipping further behind schedule and further over its original price. The very problems that had supposedly made continuing with the TSR-2 unaffordable now attached to the replacement everyone had been told was the fiscally responsible choice. So here's the answer to the question this video opened with. Why destroy the tooling and the blueprints, not just cancel the plane? Because a cancellation can be reversed by the next government, or the one after that, if the evidence sitting in a hangar somewhere keeps insisting the aircraft actually worked. Destruction can't be reversed. It was never really about the money the destruction saved, which was minimal. It was about making one political decision permanently, physically irreversible. And in doing so, it didn't just end a single aircraft program. It closed off a version of British aerospace industry that, for one brief moment in September 1964, had proven it could build something genuinely without equal anywhere on Earth. That closure had a shape you can still trace decades later. Britain's aerospace industry didn't disappear after 1965, but the version of it that had once been capable of conceiving, designing, and independently building a complete cutting-edge combat aircraft from a blank sheet of paper largely did. What followed, in the years and decades after, was an industry increasingly organized around international collaboration and around supplying components and subsystems into programs led elsewhere, rather than around leading a project of this scale alone again. There's nothing inherently wrong with that model. Plenty of excellent aircraft have been built through international partnership. But it's a different posture than the one Britain held, however briefly, in 1964, when a single national aerospace industry had just proven it could do something no one else on the planet had yet managed. Whether that shift would have happened eventually regardless is one of those questions history can't fully settle. What's not in question is that the destruction order made absolutely certain the TSR-2 itself would never be the thing that proved otherwise. Go back one final time to that hangar floor in late 1965. The cutting torches, the burning drawings, the tooling reduced to scrap metal sold off by weight. What was actually being destroyed in that room was never really steel and paper. It was the possibility of reversal, the one thing that separates an ordinary difficult decision from one an entire government apparatus decided, deliberately, could never be allowed to be questioned again. If a story like that, a triumph erased not by failure, but by a decision engineered to be permanent, is the kind of history that gets under your skin, that's exactly what this channel exists to dig into. And next time, we're going to look at a program on the other side of the Atlantic that suffered almost exactly the same fate, for almost exactly the same reasons, just a few years earlier.